So thank you to everyone who's been here all day and to anyone who's just now joining us for our third session. Welcome. We're so excited to have you here both in person and online. Really excited for this final workshop of the day with our festival. And so I'm going to introduce you to this incredible team of artists and activists located right here in Boston. This is the Boston Housing Support Coalition, and I'm going to let them actually take it away and introduce themselves, starting with Anthony Romero.
There we go. Hi, my name is Anthony Romero. I'm a professor of the practice here at Tufts University, where I'm at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, teaching art and activism and political art and things like that. And I'm a proud member of the Boston Housing Support Coalition. I'm actually going to pass it over to Jules Rochelle Sievert, who'll be working as our kind of moderator for the group for today. So Jules, why don't you take it away?
Great. I'm Jules Rochelle Sievert. I am a part of the coalition, and I also work at Northeastern University School of Law through New Law Lab, where we combine art, law, and design. And I teach, and we do a number of community programs. And these folks are people that I've had the joy of working with for about 4.5 years. And we've done some amazing work through the Boston Housing Support Coalition. And I'm going to pass it over to Gabby.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Gabriella. I grew up in East Boston, which is a neighborhood next to the airport. My family's Salvadoran Honduran, and I'm one of the co-directors of the communications department at City Life Vida Urbana. And I also help co-supervise a rent relief program at Maverick Landing Community Services, who's a proud member of the Boston Housing Support Coalition. And an artist. Thank you for having us. I'll pass it over to Rita.
Hello. Hi, I'm Rita Lara, and I'm the Executive Director of Maverick Landing Community Services, a proud member of the Housing Support Coalition. This has been a phenomenal team to work with. We're in the heart of Maverick Landing, a mixed income housing community in East Boston, and East Boston is also largely an immigrant community that's sort of secluded, sort of sequestered off by the tunnel, adjacent to the airport. And we've been focused over the last 2 years on pandemic response, mostly on food and housing, and building community.
Just before we get started, since there's such a small group, we were wondering who is in the space. You're part of our discussion, and I just want to know, are you students? Are you from the nonprofit sector? Maybe just if you feel comfortable, let us know who's in the room.
I can start since I have a microphone. I am a Fletcher student. I'm a second-year MALD, so Master in Law and Diplomacy. And I'm also working with the Refugees in Towns for this conference. So if anyone else would like to contribute and give a little bit background on who they are.
Hi, I'm Marina. I'm also a Fletcher student. I'm doing my PhD here at Fletcher, and I'm also a manager of Refugees in Towns project.
Hi everyone, so I'm Karen Jacobson. I'm a professor at Fletcher School, and I head the Refugees in Towns project, and my area is refugees and immigration, refugee policy and law and immigration policy. So it's great to have you. Thanks for coming. Do you want us to go around?
Just who were students in the room? If you can just raise your hand. So mostly students from Fletcher? Or, okay, great. So, okay, and are there any other folks from NGOs? I'm sorry.
I have a Tufts medical student on Zoom.
Nice.
Hey.
I'm teaching in the music department.
Oh, great. Artists, we have folks from public health and medicine, a lot of students. So thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon. We're going to start out just with a short kind of, I guess, again, if you can, we want to know what kind of your understanding of cultural organizing is, what that word might mean to you. And you can just shout out a couple of definitions, and then we'll get into our storytelling. But just, does that word have any significance to anyone in the room? Cultural organizing. Okay, so we're going to start out with kind of how we look at what that word is and what it means to this group. And I'm wondering, Anthony, would you like to take the lead in that discussion?
Yeah, but I'm gonna punt it over to Gabby shortly because I know Gabby's got some great things to say about it. So, you know, our group, I think, as you have probably could glean from our introductions, you know, we are working very closely with working class immigrant communities in East Boston to keep them housed. We talk a lot about how dehumanizing the structures of both immigration law and policy and housing policy are. You know, they can be very alienating. They can be not just dehumanizing, but also traumatizing and maybe administratively violent at the same time. And that's before we get to language barriers, before we get to cultural competency. You know, that's, you know, for my position as an artist, it's like built into the design of the buildings and the furniture and the paperwork and all of that. So I think from my perspective, as part of this team, cultural organizing is a way of putting culture and people at the center of our organizing efforts, right? One of the other things that you know, we've been reflecting on in advance of this conversation is also the ways in which, for many immigrant communities, because of the kinds of social service systems that they have access to, they're often forced to assimilate rather quickly. And that forced assimilation is also has a, let's say a sort of, I was gonna say deculturating, but I'm not sure if that's a word. So it has a kind of erasing, you know, it does a disservice to those communities because it forces them to kind of erase who they are and where they come from quite quickly. So maybe I'll pause there and I'll pass it over to you, Gabby, if you have other things to add.
Yeah, and okay. And, you know, for those who are in the room, like the people of color, folks who are first generation and or came from another country, do you have an experience yourself where you were seeking some sort of service in which your identity as an immigrant and as a person of color was just totally disregarded? Because that's definitely happened to me. It's definitely happened to my parents. And, you know, I remember I have a very vivid memory in the RMV here in Boston where we were in line trying to renew my mom's ID. And the lady right in front of us, she was a Latino who did not speak English, and she asked for help, right, to fill out her application in her language. And the person who was supposed to help her completely just like disregarded her, scolded her, and told her to call her friend and figure it out herself. And, you know, part of cultural organizing is putting that person's identity, right, humanizing them and meeting them where they are, right? If she needs help in Spanish, let's look for that help in Spanish, right? And not tell her to call a friend and figure it out herself, because that's just, one, totally disrespectful, and two, it makes you feel like you're not worthy of being helped, right? In a place where the state is literally supposed to serve you, right? And in cases where the state isn't serving you, like in East Boston, where during the pandemic, right, there were so many people who just completely lost their jobs for 6 months or more. Organizations like Maverick Land and Community Services decided to do something they've never done before, which is meet the people where they are and start serving food and start creating some sort of program that helps them, right, apply for rental relief, right? Because they lost their jobs for 6 months and have been unable to pay their rent for God knows how many other months, right? So part of cultural organizing is like assessing where people are and where are the communities that we are serving, right? Whether it's Latin American communities, Asian communities, Muslim communities, right? We're serving all these different people around the same time in East Boston. So that's all I would add.
So I'm wondering if we can, since you talked about the crisis, the housing crisis, but also you started to talk about what happened during the pandemic. And I'm wondering if we can tell a short story about how though we've been working together for quite a long time, there was some pretty amazing work that happened during the pandemic. And Rita, I'm wondering if you can begin with talking about your work and then how we coalesced into a coalition.
Yeah, so when the pandemic began, we were not we were not operating, for example, in food, nor were we operating in housing. We were a multi-service organization with a strong youth development and makerspace component in a mixed income housing community. And so that first week, it became really apparent that there would be a lot of people. We're in a community that's 80% in subsidized housing, and then in surrounding East Boston, a lot of people working 2, 3, 4, 5 jobs in the service, industry, suddenly out of work. So it became very apparent that a lot of people would be going hungry. So we went from the sort of sanctioned city system was to distribute school lunches. And I thought, oh my goodness, people will go hungry. So we had maybe 50 school lunches, and within weeks, we were denied an application to the local food bank, which ended up actually being a blessing, because the quality of that food can tend to be sort of overly processed, sodium cans, stuff like that. We ended up tapping into salvage networks, and it in fact was a woman who was experiencing homelessness herself in a van. She would out of her own pocket, and we paid her. She had this program that she just up and designed in response. It was the people who didn't have resources who responded, and she was one of our main salvage partners, bringing in thousands of pounds of food. We went from nothing. And then ultimately we adopted other salvage partners like Fair Foods. And we went from 50 grocery bags to 50,000 pounds a month in 4 different markets. And we scaled that up in 8 weeks with the funding that we had. We just mobilized. And that's really, what we had to do in the pandemic. We all had to do when we really centered community needs. And everything really became a response. And within months of that, it became, oh no, people are going to be, aren't going to be able to pay for their rent. They're going to be out of housing. And we were looking at a moratorium end, and that's when, and I believe the Housing Support Coalition was already meeting and having these discussions. And I approached New Law Lab at that point, and I said, oh my goodness, we need one of these eviction defense stations that I'd read about, that was designed, to be able to print out a defense so that you could take your defense to court. I said, we need one of these in every neighborhood in Boston. And then they invited me, this wonderful, crew of people invited me to join the Housing Support Coalition. And really what the work's been about is about centering community, responding to community, working collectively, and figuring out how we resource this as we go, and working through all the agreements to do that, and just putting our heads together and putting community first, and always moving with that kind of value, sense of deep, community driven values.
Anthony, I wonder if you can talk about your residency at Moya and that work that you were doing during the pandemic, and how we started to work together with you around the redistribution of funds and wealth, and the significance of putting art and culture at the center of movement building and creating meaning and cohesion.
Yeah, so like a little bit of context was that for about 1.5 years prior to the pandemic, I had been working with Jules and Dan Jackson of the New Law Lab, and in East Boston, as initially through an invitation from the Institute of Contemporary Art to create a project that engaged East Boston communities. And it was through that initial work, which in part produced a board game, which you can see pictures of, young folks playing, which worked to educate folks about histories of activism within Boston, as well as housing rights, descriptions of what the Zoning Board of Appeals does, how zoning law works, what the Office of Housing Stability does, how their policies work. So a kind of popular education board game. And I had been invited to be an artist in residence with the City of Boston, where I was placed at in the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Advancement. And the way that program works, for those who are unfamiliar, is that artists are selected. It's typically between 4 and 5 artists, and we are embedded within a department in the city for at least a year. I ended up being embedded in the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Advancement for about 18 months. And we work really closely to develop any number of projects with our city staff collaborators and our community partners. So I had gone into the residency thinking that we would kind of continue the initial work that we had set out to do, that we were doing prior to the pandemic. But I started the residency in March of the beginning of the pandemic, which maybe in an odd way is an anniversary for us, given that now it's March again. But and what became very, we very quickly, inside of the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Advancement, it very quickly pivoted to trying to understand the crisis as it was impacting immigrant communities across Boston. So what that looked like from my end was that Moya policy advisors were quickly assembling research about the demographic makeup and the impacts of the pandemic. And some of that research was incredibly detailed. Drilling down to different immigrant populations, where they are across the city, what are their jobs, what is their healthcare systems, what are they, what do they have access to, what do they not have access to, and how has the pandemic then in turn immobilized them or created more barriers, or in many cases resulted in unemployment or evictions. And housing very quickly became visible as this sort of nexus point for all of these things in the middle of the pandemic, right? We're talking about populations across the city who tend to live very densely inside of one apartment or one house, right? You often see multiple generations living very closely together, many people in one room, or many people sharing a single apartment or a single home. You also find people really kind of sharing networks of care, which were suddenly put in danger, right? That you have churches or community centers being shut down. You have all of these social spaces that you're suddenly cut off from. What we know from that early demographic analysis was that, what most immigrant populations, kind of broadly speaking across the city, were doing was that they were working in home healthcare. It was big for many immigrant populations. The Haitian community, for example, is like upwards of 90% of them are employed in home healthcare systems at the start of the pandemic. Construction work, frontline workers, all of these things, right? So we kind of reassembled ourselves, and I think in part thinking through the kinds of quick mobilizations that communities were doing to address this for themselves, right? To like further build out these networks of care in the wake of the pandemic in order to take care of themselves when the state failed them. Which maybe in some ways, like, I think maybe some ways communities like the ones we're talking about, the state has failed them repeatedly, and sometimes multiple states have failed them repeatedly. So I think there already are practices of care that are in place that were maybe more easy to mobilize than in other communities. So we kind of came together with Rita and developed what would eventually become Boston, what we call the Boston Housing Support Stations, which is these 2 computer terminals. You'll also see images of those, which are housed at Maverick Landing Community Services that provide folks with the legal knowledge and the technology necessary to stay housed in the simplest of terms. So then maybe to the second part of Jules's question, what then became my undertaking as an artist was what I've come to refer to as the creative redistribution of resources as my artistic practice, right? So I kind of went in thinking that we were going to do community engagement. We were going to, maybe we would make a public art project. None of those things were possible, right? Like a lot of those questions for me around like, what is public art without a public at the beginning of a pandemic, really kind of reoriented themselves around these questions of resources and how to redistribute resources. So then my task, right, my practice really became making an argument to the city to fund, say, mutual aid workers at Maverick Landing who are doing housing stabilizing work. And that's really what it became. I mean, there was a long back and forth with the city, and there was a lot of negotiation in regards to that, but it's very important to me to just take the funds that they had given me and funnel as much as possible into the work that was already happening in the community. And that's what we did. So we gave, about 85% of the total project budget over to mutual aid and Maverick Landing for that matter. We also gave a donation to Maverick Landing to help support that work.
I'm wondering if we can really talk in detail about what happened on the ground with mutual aid and what, Anthony just told a fantastic story about redistribution of wealth and putting it to people that were actively working. So what did that look like at Maverick Landing and what were they doing?
It's been really incredible to see and be part of the response on the ground. And so, and what's really happened is a whole new sort of ecology of how we work together has emerged, right, post-pandemic. And mutual aid is a very, very important network in this ecology, and was among, the most responsive. It's an ecology that created a common sense of values that all the participating people and organizations, adopted. And so Maverick Landing is one of 3 core organizations that is part of mutual aid. And in the beginning, what it looked like is just responsive, coordination on WhatsApp. And this is what I have, what do you have? I have a family who needs this, and just a lot of rapid response and pooling resources. And there were entities that just acted and became community responsive. And it really wasn't everyone. There were some entities in the community that remained institutionally responsive. So those are very 2 different things. and there's also sort of, if you were to draw it in a Venn diagram, there's a sweet spot of your institutionally responsive and your community responsive. But these are important concepts, and they were really playing out on the ground in terms of who stepped up to the plate and how we worked together and how we coordinated resources. And so when we began to develop the lab on the ground, it really makes sense to develop the lab with the mutual aid. So mutual aid workers have been both operating the lab along with Maverick Landing, residents. They've been trained to be housing advocates. And they've also been a big part of referring people to the program. They have great networks, and they sort of organize broadly in the community, supporting people and helping people and trying to meet them where they are. And so they've been important. They've been an important referral source, for people. And where that work as of at least as of December, where that work has gone is we've done a lot of housing support applications, which are long and tedious and very bureaucratic, and a system that's not very community responsive and constantly changing. And regardless of our resources, we've had to adapt to those changes constantly. And we've helped nearly 100 families with $417,000 that directly went to pay and support them with their housing.
Gabby, I'm wondering if you can talk about the kind of the grassroots activism that you did in helping people fill out the forms and that whole system. So I think we're kind of missing a bit of a narrative there. So I'm wondering if you can talk in detail about filling out the RAF forms, filling out the kind of anti-displacement rental relief forms, what that meant for the community, and also some complications. I mean, the courts were closed, things were closed, we couldn't be in contact with each other. So I'm just wondering if you can talk about how you and City Life and folks did trainings over Zoom and what that looked like during the pandemic.
Yeah, most definitely. So the state of Massachusetts had one of the strongest statewide moratoriums in the country, which meant that all the housing courts were closed for all forms of evictions and foreclosures, unless it was like a violence related eviction. And once that expired in October 2020, we only had the national moratorium, which did not protect all tenants. It did not protect homeowners who lost their jobs. It only protected a fraction of tenants who were falling behind on rent, which is great, right? We needed that, but we needed more, and we still need more. And, you know, around that time, Governor Baker created something called the Eviction Diversion Initiative, which was ultimately Baker's way of pumping in money and providing lawyers statewide, which is needed, but it was temporary, alongside with more money into the statewide rent relief fund. And there is this like misconception amongst legislators that they just think that the housing crisis is going to be solved if we give people enough money, right, to cover their debts. But money is not the solution to the housing crisis. But money, right, is the solution to at least keep people housed for a little longer so they don't face homelessness immediately, right? Because as we were saying earlier, people lost their jobs for 6 months plus, right? How are you going to pay a $1,500 rent when you haven't worked for 6 months? How are you going to pay a rent increase, or how are you even going to face emotionally and mentally a rent increase when you barely have enough to buy your family the food they enjoy, right? And we were just seeing a lot of pain, not just in East Boston, but across the state, where people just did not have not only enough money, but they just didn't have hope, right, when it came to staying housed. And part of the rent relief work we did with Maverick Landing Community Services, you know, we trained community members to support other community members and paid those community members to do the work of supporting others in applying for these complicated and tedious and intimidating statewide rent relief applications. And, you know, we know people that have applied for those applications like 5 times, and either their applications were closed out, or they had to submit like a particular document 4 times, even though they already submitted it, because caseworkers on the state side were just flipping over and over, right? They weren't retaining their own employees, which made it harder for community members who needed this help. So what we did was try to figure out, okay, who is subcontracted by the state, and who are those subcontractors, and what benefits are those subcontractors receiving in regards to the timeline of how applications are actually processed. And we actually found out that one of our local health centers, the East Boston Neighborhood Health Center, they were subcontracted, and they were like pumping in and out applications faster than what an average person would. Because I literally work with people who were trying to get their application approved for 4 months. That's terrible. That is horrible, right? 4 months, one application, 4 months. You submit it like 3 or 4 times. With the health center, they were submitting applications once. They didn't have to like resubmit certain documents, required documents. So we're like, okay, let's create a partnership with the health center and try to strengthen and penetrate this like privilege the health center has with the work we're trying to do to help more people. And you know, now we, like you heard Rita, I don't even remember, I don't keep track how much money we actually, $417,000 were distributed because of the work we're doing, and more because we haven't counted the last 3 months. We haven't counted the last 3 months. So if our program didn't exist, that money would have never gotten to those people. And those people would have most likely received their notice to quit for non-payment reasons, have been too scared to even try to fight it, and would have, you know, gone to another home. It's really interesting that in the city of Boston, you know, the highest rates of evictions, 7 out of 10 eviction court filings are from people of color. And some of the neighborhoods with the highest rates of evictions are neighborhoods like Roxbury, Dorchester, that have the highest numbers of Black tenants, right? So we're seeing a strong correlation of the housing crisis and the need for racial justice. And you know what's really interesting? That East Boston, one of the neighborhoods that has some of the highest numbers of immigrants and undocumented immigrants, have some of the lowest eviction filing numbers. You want to know why? Well, because the way like immigrant culture works is, you know, you associate ICE with the courts. You associate the fear of being deported with being near a court, right? We know people who have seen ICE agents outside the courts trying to fish out people to deport, to deport and separate from their families. So when people see a notice to quit or receive a text message demanding them to leave their homes and to evict, they're going to leave immediately. They're not going to want to fight because there's this fear of deportation when it comes to like fighting in the courts. What a lot of people don't know is that they have tenant rights, and fighting your eviction in court has nothing to do with your immigration status. It's actually against the civil rights for a landlord to say, I'm going to call immigration if you don't evict the day I'm asking you to. Like, that's literally illegal, but people don't know that, right? So that's why it's so important within the work I do with City Life and in the intersection I'm supporting with at Maverick Landing Community Services is, you know, trying to figure out how can we spread this information, real information, people's tenants' rights in a way that's culturally appropriate, in a way that's going to resonate with them, in a way in which is going to remind these community members that they're not alone, right? So many people who are facing rent increases or an eviction or foreclosure, they feel ashamed. They don't want to talk about it. You know, it's very shameful. And, you know, the importance of what I do in my job is like trying to bring this information into the community in different ways. Like at City Life, we have weekly meetings that used to be in person that now are on Zoom, English and Spanish, a day just for English and a day just for Spanish, right? Because even in these like English interpretation spaces, it's really intimidating for someone who doesn't know English, right? So it's better to like be in a space that's appropriate to your culture. And within those spaces, like practice certain traditions, right? To form community and to feel like you're not alone. And one of those traditions within the City Life meetings is, you know, we ask people, oh, who's here for the first time? Why are you here? And there's another section of the meeting where we ask certain community members ahead of time if they're willing to share their story. And one of the most recent stories that was shared from someone was, you know, he's an undocumented immigrant, and you know, kind of like the gist of the story was, I was so afraid, I was ready to, and he's young. He was like, the landlord is taking advantage of me. She thinks I'm young and like I'm this like stupid young adult. She threatened to call ICE on me, And now he's going to face her in court and represent himself because, you know, there just isn't enough legal representation for him to find, but he's going to represent himself against this abusive landlord after him thinking that he had to find another place to move into because he didn't know he had tenant rights and that he has rights at every single step of the eviction process. So, and what you see here on the floor is a timeline that we developed with youth in East Boston as part of like the project in Maverick Land and Community Services. There was a Eastie Evolution exhibit. Like there's a greenway, a big bike path in East Boston that brings you from like one point to another. And there was like different stops, and one around environmental justice, food justice, and gentrification. Like, what is gentrification? And we created this timeline together in which, you know, people who were walking by, we encouraged them to write out, one, what year were they evicted? And two, in green, what year were you evicted? You see 2008 from the foreclosure crisis to, at that point, it was 2021, last year. And on orange, how, to write, have you faced a rent increase and how much? So you see a lot of different numbers here, from like $100 to, I see a $500 rent increase over there in 2020. Oof, that's terrible. And then I'm curious with you all, like, have you all, who here rents? Raise your hand. So we have a lot of tenants in the room, okay? Who's experienced a rent increase in the past since the pandemic started? It's not easy, right? It's not easy. So you know.
I'm wondering, you know, I listened to a couple of different things that came up for me when you were talking. You know, you talked about the place where you're meeting people. Sometimes you mentioned that there's a sense of shame, or that people kind of internalize the experience that is happening with, you know, displacement. And, you know, you also talked about, you know, getting people to participate in, you know, working on this timeline with you. And as I kind of look through our image archive, there's so much, you know, amazing signage and images. You know, Rita, you've talked a lot about the value of your makerspace and youth coming in there. And Anthony, of course, you've engaged all different types of people in the actions of making and doing. And so we've heard about, you know, displacement and the hardship and the shame around that. And you know, we've talked about racial inequity and the lack of language justice. And I'm just wondering if we can reflect on how kind of these other types of activities, you know, kind of existing in the realm of making and doing, how that builds resilience or connection or belonging as we work through kind of the shame associated with our economics, or with the threat of eviction, or our citizenship status, et cetera. I'm just wondering, you know, what is the value of coming together on those Tuesday nights, or coming together in a maker space, or community meals, or food line? I'm just wondering, how does that create meaning, connection, and belonging? And anybody can start. You know, Rita, Anthony, would you like to comment?
Okay. You know, just with this timeline alone, like one of the goals with this timeline was to see that your little piece of paper, your story, your experience is not alone, right? Your experience is in conjunction with all of these other people here. And there's thousands of more that, you know, this little time, this banner doesn't capture, right? Because this is part of a community event. And you here, like you saw, or I saw, maybe you didn't turn your head, you know, there were a few hands up. Like you're not alone. Even in this room, you're not alone. And the importance of having those community meetings is for people to see that they're in community, they're not alone. And we've had certain projects in relation with some SMFA students where we created like masks that said greed with like a big cancel sign on it, which one of our youth organizers helped create. Her name is Alexandra. You know, if you see someone else with that same mask, you're like, oh you were in action. Like, we're in this together. You're part of the movement. We've created like shirts again with those same students, with one of the saints, Monsignor Romero. He was a pastor in El Salvador who was assassinated during the Civil War due to his resistance. And you know, a lot of Central Americans, a lot of Latin Americans, like they see his face and they know, like, not only did it say like housing justice is racial justice, but they know that implication of like, you know, they were displaced from their home countries because of that cause of the resistance that this man's face reminds them of, right? And we had, throughout the summer, we had a dry relief print workshop in which one of Jules' past students as well, also from SMFA, he applied for a grant and he reached out to City Life saying, hey, I got this money. I wanted to see how can I best support you all? And, you know, there's just so much crisis happening. We were just thinking, how can we instill joy into the community and also create and connect it to culture and art? And that's when we did the dry relief print workshops, where we looked for a bilingual dry relief printmaker, and they led us through a wonderful workshop describing, you know, the history behind social political movements in dry relief printing in regards to the civil rights movement in Honduras, when labor workers unionized and like struck against the banana empire. Around Mexico, in Oaxaca, there was like a dry relief print movement there, you know, and connecting it to today, like what can we create with this dry relief print that represents the causes we care for? And the images we saw from people were really powerful, from, you know, US imperialism out of Asia to there was another one where an elderly woman, she drew a bird in a nest and a bulldozer like trying to destroy their tree and nests. And she lived in the neighborhood right next door, where she was seeing a house being demolished where she once saw families living in. So that was like kind of like her way of interpreting that violence she saw within those families being displaced, with this bird and their eggs and babies in this nest being bulldozed by the tree. So that's kind of like a way in which like I've tapped in with Tufts students who've used, you know, their privilege from school and their resources from school and grants from school to bring back into the East Boston community, into the housing justice movement, to create this solidarity, right, amongst academia, art, culture, and resistance. You know, I'll pass it.
You know, part of what we're talking about is sort of the power of art and the act of creation, and in a community like East Boston. So, for example, you know, our makerspace in the heart of a mixed income housing development, that's, you know, privately managed, right? So a lot of the space is private. We can't leave things up. We step out of our community into a community that's rapidly gentrifying. Multi-billion dollar developments springing up everywhere. And I mean everywhere, from one day to the next. So our space is really important, right? In our community, space is really important. So every day you step out into the world, and the world is changing, and you see less and less and less of yourself in it. So the power of making community is about, right? Yes, I exist and I created this. And that's really important given the context of everything that's happening. That's part of our spirit, that's part of our health, that's part of staying connected, that's an act of resistance to not be alienated in your own community.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Anthony, if you can, you know, again, reflect on this sort of process of making and doing, but how these things begin to shift dominant narrative, right? By the recreation of stories, or imaging ourselves differently, imaging ourselves within a movement, or aligning ourselves in terms of sort of global justice or global housing justice, right?
Yeah, that's kind of where I was thinking. I think we were on the same wave because there's a couple of things that I think are interesting in this context, in regards to these narratives. One thing that's interesting, for example, that I was just talking with some other folks about is that, as someone who didn't grow up in East Boston, I grew up in South Texas. I grew up in the shadow of the border, the southern border, and I have only been in Boston for a handful of years. But one thing that's kind of interesting is 5 years ago when I got here, and maybe some of you, given the context of this conference, might remember this, but there was a lot of conversation about the expansion of border checkpoints in New England because ICE's jurisdiction, right, is 100 kilometers or so from the shores, which is most of New England. And so there was a lot of conversations about expansion of checkpoints in Maine and New Hampshire. And I thought, as someone who grew up in proximity to the southern border and has very distinct and clear memories of the anxieties of moving through those checkpoints, I thought, what a kind of interesting echo, right? Because to that point about dominant narratives is, I think that they're, even within the kinds of communities that we work in, right? Even within, the context of immigration, there's a lot of misconception because of the way dominant narratives about how immigrant communities, like who are immigrant communities, what they look like, what they sound like, where they come from, all of these kinds of things, right? And we might not think, for example, about what happens when you're pinned between a housing crisis and a migrant crisis or an immigrant crisis, right? Like what happens when you are at the intersection of two systems which are opposed to you and to who you are and to who your family are and to how you arrived here. So one thing, for example, that I remember very clearly, maybe to the point about mental health during the introductions, was that when I started working in East Boston, Jules and Dan, who's not here, who's Jules' counterpart at the Law Lab, we started holding a number of community listening sessions. Because I'm not from East Boston, and because we were being financed at the time through a museum, which is always suspect, as institutions are always kind of suspects. That was my tough. But I had to whisper it because we're being recorded. But the two things that rose really fast, right, were one was gentrification and the other was mental health. Mental health was a huge thing that we heard a lot about. And the way those two things kind of work together at these intersections was the ways in which, I remember hearing from folks in the community that so many folks were being re-traumatized because they're immigrants, because they're folks who have resettled, who have already been forcibly displaced once, who've on all manner of violence. And we're now being, because of the speed of gentrification in a neighborhood like East Boston, that speed again was producing these conditions where they were being triggered, right? Where they had come from a context, the way that it was described to me, they'd come from a context where maybe you would wake up and your neighbors would be gone and you wouldn't know why they were gone. And then suddenly, or you wake up and, your parents are ushering you out the door and you're leaving in the middle of the night, and that these conditions, and I think maybe still, Gabby, from I think your reflections, is kind of echoed in that urgency and in that trauma. But those are the conditions that we're operating against, right? And I think we in particular are always trying to be mindful of what that is, what those impacts are, broadly speaking, that yes, of course, you need to stay housed for sure, but you also need food, you also need healthcare. You also, your kid needs a laptop because now they're virtual and you're in the middle of being evicted, but everybody's being homeschooled. So what are you going to do? We can see these kind of compounding stress, right? And I think to just circle back to the cultural organizing component for us, or how can we pull that in, these moments where we can really we can share a meal, or we can share a song, or we can make something together, or, we can the way that we sometimes talk about it in art education is really through kind of trauma informed making, right? Which is this idea that like, you know, you have all of this stress, you have all of this trauma, and it so often can be deeply internalized, and it makes it difficult for you to articulate it. But if you can move through it, right? Like if you can give it a form, you know, maybe a nest with eggs, then that's something you can talk about, right? Like maybe you can't talk about what made you make that image quite yet, but making that image is one step closer to being able to heal yourself. And I think one of the things that is, you know, that I think I'm always trying to think about, and I was thinking about it even now, is like, how do we hold these two things at the same time? Like, how do we hold the fact of violence and brutality, whether we're talking about gentrification or we're talking about the immigration system, you know, or whatever? How do we speak to the truth of those experiences while not allowing those things to be the defining characteristics of these communities, right? Because the most beautiful thing to me is that there's so much, and I think sometimes we want to describe it as resiliency, but I wouldn't necessarily describe it that way, because I think it is beautiful that despite all of those things, there's still joy, and there's still care, and there's still love, and there's still culture, and people do, you know, we still can have a meal, and we still can sing that song. That all of those things can happen despite being in free fall. I think is one of the reasons for me why it's so important that we kind of center these activities at the same time, right? That we utilize them together.
Jules, I had a quick question, if you don't mind. A question from the audience.
Okay.
Sorry. I wanted to snag in because this is a really great conversation. And this weekend, we've really been talking about resettlement. So getting a different perspective and just broadening that to, you know, immigrant groups in general has been really enlightening. But while we're on the topic of art and the meaning, I just wanted to ask, like, so some of our conversations have focused on the political salience of art. And I was just wondering if you can talk about maybe particular, Anthony, your new book, maybe how your art advances the social justice underpinnings of your work. If we could just talk about that, I'd love to hear. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I would turn it back to the group. I mean, in part because I don't do anything alone. I mean, even just being up here now, I'm like super grateful for all of these. You can't see it because I have my mask on, and it would probably be inappropriate to be smiling this much in the context of this conversation. But I'm super grateful for this group of people, you know, for that reason, because I feel like that balance is what's necessary, right? That, like, you know, I think even, you know, Gabby's reflections, or what Rita does on the ground, you know, or Jules's context in a law school, like those things help ground us in the reality of what we're doing. Right? Because I think, like, from my position, and I would be curious, you know, Jules and Gabby, for y'all too, as artists, like, I have never really been interested in the symbolic purely on its own, right? Like that there's always a context for the art. And I think especially now and in the last 2 years, for example, one of the things that we have been talking a lot about in relationship to funding is that I feel like a lot of my work as of late with the coalition has been about making an argument to arts and culture funders that stabilizing communities is inherently a part of cultural policy. And that is a way for me to, like, create a situation where we can continue to fund these mutual aid workers. And I can be as transparent as one can with financial gatekeepers. But that, you know, that feels like an important point. It feels like an important point that we're kind of always grounded in the movement, you know, that we're always kind of centering what's happening on the ground. But Jules and Gabby, I wonder what you say.
I think there's Anthony brings up a really important conversation about cultural policy and equity. I think in this city and other cities, about, you know, where are our resources being distributed to, who is able to access them, and what type of work is getting funded. If we do that analysis pretty much in every city, we're going to be able to begin to understand the inequities, the racial inequities there, the gender inequities, the inequities around class and education, pretty much across the board. So working in this way and having that awareness and understanding of the lack of equity in terms of resources and funding in culture, finding ways to distribute that wealth differently in our communities is pretty critical, I think, to our work and the way that we're approaching it, or the way that we're moving through our coalition. Rita, would you like to?
I think working in this way gives us perspective. I think it gives us power. And I think it makes us capable of affecting policy from wherever we sit or stand on the ground. And I think, and sort of pre-pandemic, I will say, I did not feel like I could, as an executive director of a small grassroots organization, I didn't feel I had the reach or the ability to affect any kind of policy change. I no longer feel that way because of this group, because we have a table with lawyers, artists, organizers, activists, policymakers. We have reach, and we are all understanding and sort of having conversations about what's happening, pulling it into a compelling narrative, and using our respective influence to affect change. And it's not about the money, it's about who's at the table. and sure, we need to resource the work, but resourcing the work becomes, and having a much more robust impact becomes much more easy when you have a really diverse table of possibility.
Okay, so I want to open it up to questions or comments from the room. If anybody has questions, just you can go ahead and raise your hand, or I can bring the mic over. Any questions or comments?
I can start with one. Thank you so much. This was really interesting. As Maggie said, we talk a lot about resettlement this weekend too. And I think often when we talk about refugees and displacement, we focus on resettlement in the context of Boston. We don't talk enough about displacement that's ongoing for all different kinds of communities all the time. So thank you for bringing that important point here for us to talk. Anthony, you mentioned trauma-informed making, and I was really curious to kind of hear more about that. How that really works in practice with the communities and for your group as well, if you can share some of that with us.
Yeah, maybe I will pass it down. Rita and Gabby, I'm just thinking as like folks who are, I'm wondering if there's a story or if there's like a moment at Maverick Landing that kind of describes that.
I could share a little bit about some of the work in our makerspace, and also just about oftentimes when people are experiencing trauma, it's very embodied. There are no words. Oftentimes there is no language for it. And it's through movement, or it's through creation that one can begin to develop a kind of language for it. So it's a very, I think healing trauma is a very deeply personal process that is very, very much a creative process, and that is very much an embodied, process for many, and doesn't really have a language. So art and making, creating, becomes an essential part of processing that. And I will say in our makerspace work, one of the things, we've done is to create an opportunity for young people to design and develop one of the things we're making in particular is this journal. So we've made gratitude journals, and we've made I Love Eastie journals, you know, journals that really empower young people around their community. This is their community. They're making these journals that have their that have words about the power of their community or the power of what they're feeling. They've even designed their own journals. And it's been an interesting process to watch, you know, some of the young people. One young person in particular was distributing, you know, we were distributing food most of the time, and some of the young people were, we have young people working in just about every area. We have housing ambassadors, and we have food justice, you know, workers, and we have this production and design, young people working in production and design in a makerspace. And one young person sort of coming through food, and he just had I don't know how to use it. I don't know how to use, you know, laser cutters. He was very intimidated by even some of the things, or didn't even conceive of himself as like being able to design something. And just the process of figuring out what his journal would look like and designing it and making it was just incredibly powerful to see his own sort of evolution, and sort of, you know, bringing something into existence that didn't previously exist. And it's a powerful thing that's hard to even sort of characterize, and that can be really personal for people. And I've definitely seen that process in some of the young people.
I think that art or poetry, journal making, even banner making can be an entry point to begin to have a broader dialogue with somebody. So it's oftentimes an entry point to having a broader conversation about, you know, some of the harms that we have experienced in society. So that process of making and doing, sometimes you can focus on, you know, making a anti-displacement banner as the thing that you do together, but you're also sort of bridging silences. So that kind of process of using that understanding of the traumas that individuals have experienced, but then using making and doing as a way to begin to build trust, to build community, and also build safety in being able to have a conversation about some of the harms that individuals have experienced. So for me, that's trauma-informed making.
Gabby, did you have anything you want to add?
Personal experience, you know, part of my trauma was missing out on, you know, particular family events due to certain restraining orders. And, you know, my main medium of art is with my camera. I'm a photographer. I create short documentaries, and, you know, it wasn't until recently, and when I was reflecting, like, why do I take pictures? Why do I make videos? Like, why do I do that? And, you know, kind of had to like self-reflect and realize, damn, like this is part of me dealing with my trauma and healing from my trauma through documentation, you know, because I missed out on, you know, so many particular like intimate like family events. You know, I did not take for granted, you know, certain moments with like people that I chose as like family. You know, like I was always kind of like that person with the camera, like taking candid pictures, just like taking videos. People like, why are you doing it? I'm like, because I want to document this moment. And also because of certain like ancestral trauma that we're still carrying, you know, as someone who was born in Boston, like from parents who had to flee and refuge out of El Salvador because of the Civil War, you know, there's so much history that in El Salvador and just in Latin America in general and across the world, where literally history was burnt by colonizers because they're trying to erase like your history and your humanity. And like me reflecting on it as being a photographer and documentalist is like, yo, maybe this is connected to like the generations of erasure that has been forced onto the generations of communities that I'm connected to. So I never thought of it as like me creating art out of like the trauma I'm trying to heal from, but that's something that I personally realized and reflected when I was just trying to understand like why am I creating and what brought me to the camera, right? And how did I expand from the camera to organizing, to activism that brought me to organizing, right? In a place where now I'm leading activists and teaching them to and creating leaders, right? From multiple generations, people like my mom who are like 50 years old plus, like we're supporting their leadership and developing their leadership while at the same time supporting the leadership of someone who's like 17 years old. And that's something that's like really, really powerful and resonates with me when it comes to cultural organizing and healing and being in community.
I just wonder, are those activities separate from you, right? Separate, like the process you talked about, being a filmmaker and a photographer as part of your own, activating your own healing and sort of witnessing and celebrating, celebrations or celebrating things through activating your camera. Is that a different experience than the organizing you do, or is it a connected experience, right? So that's this sort of, are you always an artist, or is there a separation between your creativity and your activism, or is it a connected thing?
I used to think they were separated. Activism, my organizing radical background and my artistry, but it wasn't until a certain time in my life where I was taking particular classes where there was the first time ever at UMass Boston where the political science professor and a literature professor did a joint class called literally The Art of Resistance. They're great, they're amazing. And it wasn't until then in which kind of like in conjunction with another workshop that I was taking like independently led by an indigenous leader from Peru, it wasn't until then that in conjunction with like both teachings where I learned that art is resistance. And like my resistance is a form of art, but art in the eye of like Western settler colonialism, like where we're living right now, is art that you see at the Museum of Fine Arts, right? It's art that caters to the white gaze. But from, this indigenous professor, Maestro Zahir, he taught us, he's like, in our cultures, in these indigenous roots, art is you connecting with your community. Like you being a cook, you being able to write, you being able to like connect with people, that is a form of art. But in the white gaze, like you being able to cook well, that's not artistic because you can't paint a Picasso-like picture. And it wasn't until then that I kind of like understood a little more and started to explore, a more of like a cosmic indigenous like perspective and understanding of what art is in relation to resistance. That art is resistance. So yeah, I totally connect it. And it didn't start like that. It was a process, it was a journey. And I think Rita wanted to share something too.
I also think art is sort of medicine to the trauma of the erasure, right? That we see from the gentrification of what we're experiencing. And the cultural organizing is really, how do we change these things? Well, almost everything is a function of culture, you know, when we think of the increasing rents have increased pretty exponentially, right? Well, people say, well, that's supply and demand. It's just sort of accepted, right? It's economics, it's supply and demand. But if costs haven't changed for a landlord, is it really demand, or is it a function of culture that prices are increasing? So cultural organizing provides, I think, an opportunity for us to really begin to question assumptions that create the systems that contribute to trauma and erasure and a lot of pain for people.
I'm wondering if we can talk about what's in the future for this group. I'm really excited to hear about the spatial justice grant and the housing justice fair that's coming up, and kind of something that's coming up in the future. I'm wondering, Anthony or Gabby, if you want to tell that story.
Okay. So when the coalition started forming, we had all of these ideas about things that we thought we would be able to sneak into the work. You know, from taking folks' stories about being evicted and turning them into songs, or turning them into plays, or, you know, creating a festival of sorts where that would do all these things kind of simultaneously, right? That would be a way for people to share their stories, for a way to kind of humanize, to create community building, to share resources, to do popular education around housing rights, all this kind of stuff. So we're very happy to say that after 2 years of sitting on most of those ideas, we have gotten some funding from the New England Foundation for the Arts to make that real. And so what we are embarking on now, and maybe I will also just pause to say that I think it happened concurrently with the strategic planning retreat, which we all did at the end of last year, to kind of figure out, well, you know, 2 years in, we have this infrastructure, we have all these volunteers, we know what the process looks like to help people stay housed through the system that we built. I mean, we're always in need of language support. So Spanish language interpreter students, feel free to reach out at any point if you want to do some volunteering. I just thought I'd make a call. We do always need Spanish language interpretation. But you know, that we have all these things in place. So what can we do now? And one of those things was to create a greater bridge between the food program, food distribution, and the other was to embark on a kind of in-person cultural events, which is the thing that we're starting to plan now. The process is still very organic. It's still driven by the community. It'll start with a series of community dinners with some invited guests. We want to distribute home test kits through the community. We want to distribute PPEs and masks and make sure everybody is safe and put our COVID protocols in place and all of those things. And then I think, you know, Gabby, please step in if you feel like there are other things that we should say, but the idea as of now is to kind of build through these community meetings with local community leaders to build out the scope and the kind of scale of the cultural events and programs that we want to do.
Anthony, I'm so sorry. I did get the time wrong. So if we could just have some last thoughts from the panelists and then we can wrap up. I apologize about that.
No problem. Why don't you go, Gabby? And then we can do-
Yeah, we're always looking for volunteers. So if you want to support through Zoom or remotely, like Anthony said, we're always looking for interpreters, English to Spanish, every once in a while, like Brazilian Portuguese, through Maverick Landing Community Services and also at City Life Youth Urbana. We have actions, protests through City Life every once in a while, actually pretty often, at least a few times a month. And we all have Facebook and Instagrams and Twitter. So look us up, Maverick Landing Community Services and City Life Vida Urbana. And we'd love to have you join us outside of the space on the ground. And yeah, follow us. That way, if you're around and in town, And we're planning to have the Housing Justice Parade around September. So we'd love for y'all to join us, but for you to come, you need to follow us so you stay updated. And yeah, thank you so much for having us. And if you ever have opportunities through your university to apply for a grant and partner with a nonprofit, you already have a couple options here. So definitely reach out.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for being here today. I guess one last thing from Rita.
I'm being told to tell them about the journals. So one of the ways we resource our young people to do the work in our community is to design and make journals. And it just creates a great opportunity to diversify our resources and to really create sort of a channel for resources that don't have us jumping through hoops to do the work that we know needs to be done. And that's always really important because there are a lot of hoops to jump through. And so if you're interested in purchasing gratitude journals or I Love Eastie journals, you could actually put any design you want on it. Or if you work for a program or a group or a team, part of a team or a company, you could order, a bunch of journals for your team or for your company. And we have youth design journals. So they're beautiful, and the kids always love it when they get orders with their own design. And that goes directly to, the young people in the program. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
All right. And thank you so much again to Anthony, Jules, Gabriella, and Rita. This, I think, really tied together a lot of what we were talking about, especially with the journal of just this kind of art and expression and how that all works. So thank you to our final group that we had here. In just a few minutes, we're actually going to move